This story is from the perspective of a female. As a child, I would catch the train home from my school because no one would be able to pick me up, and I refused to go to after-school care. In 2003, on a normal day, I got the train home and sat down near one of the windows. After a while, I started to get this weird feeling, so I stopped looking out the window and look around the train and take note of the other passengers. And there he is. One of the creepiest men I've ever had the displeasure of encountering. He was severely overweight, balding, wearing gold wire-rimmed glasses. He wore grey track pants with a matching sweater, both with visible stains and a few tears. This guy is staring at me, not just looking or in my general direction, but intently staring. It made my skin crawl. I am freaking out and look to the other people trying to catch their eye. Most people would see what was happening, but look away as to not get involved. It has been 3 stops, and no one will help me. When this teenager gets on, he looks at the man and follows his gaze to me. Without hesitation, this teenager walks over to me and says loudly,
"Hey babe, I haven't seen you in ages. How have you been?"
He sits down and puts his arm around me. He leans in, as if he was about to kiss me on the cheek, but instead whispers,
"I don't like the way he is looking at you."
This guy sits with me for the last 2 stops, and the creepy guy is no longer staring at me intently, but instead giving the teen daggers. The same look you give someone who took the thing you wanted. The teenager gets off at my stop. I ask him if it was his stop, but it isn't. He had to stay on until the end of the line, but then says he just wanted to make sure I was safe and insisted that I walk along the main roads as there are a lot of creeps around. I thank him and ask if he'd like me to keep him company whilst he waited. He said no and insisted I go straight home where I would be safe. I never saw the teenager or the creepy man again, but the scariest part is 10 or so years later. I tell this story to my now husband, and he tells me I was lucky the teenager got on the train and sat with me. Looking it up, he showed me that the same day, about 4 stops down, a girl only 3 years older than me went missing and was found murdered and sexually assaulted. They caught the guy and he was sentenced, but it was the same man who had been staring at me. This story is from the perspective of a female. When I was 21, I left my long-term abusive boyfriend, James. He was furious when it ended, and to be quite honest, I was terrified. At first he would just harass me, call me, message me at all hours of the day and night. I tried not to think too much into it. At points he'd be begging me to come back, telling me how sorry he was for everything he'd ever done. Other times he'd be calling me, screaming at me, calling me a whore along with other things, saying that everything was my fault and I should be ashamed. I did my best to ignore this. Anytime I saw it was him calling, I would ignore. Anytime he messaged me, I would delete it without reading. The first instance where I knew this was getting serious, and I was possibly in some level of danger, was the first time that I noticed that he'd re-added himself on Facebook. I hadn't changed my password by this time. It had only been a month, and I was too busy trying to recollect myself. I only noticed because he had posted a status about seeing all of your ex's status updates. The thing is, I remember so clearly deleting his gaming Facebook, along with every other Facebook page he had. Knowing that, I instantly knew he'd logged into my Facebook. I changed the password immediately and blocked that account. I got a message shortly after calling me a bitch, but I didn't read too far into it. It wasn't my problem. I didn't want to deal with him. After a while, the messages stopped, and he kept calling and calling and calling. One day he rang me whilst I was out on a date. The number was private, and I thought maybe it had been one of the jobs I'd applied for. So I answered, and it was him. He asked me what I was doing and where I was. I straight up told him it was none of his business what I was doing. He then started yelling at me, telling me he knew where I was. He knew I was at the beach. He knew I was there with a guy. I told him again it was none of his business and to leave me alone. I hung up on him and continued my date. I was shaken, and my date could see this, so he took me away from the beach and we went elsewhere. The calling and harassment continued for more than 6 months, and he wouldn't stop harassing me over anything. He would call me up accusing me of dating other guys whilst I was with him. After these 6 months, the calling finally stopped, and so did the messaging, from him at least. Then his friends started to message me, messages including statements like I was a slut, that James had always hated me, that everyone hated me, that I should kill myself, that my mother should have aborted me. And then some really bizarre ones accusing me of having had an abortion. Just to be clear, although I had had pregnancy scares during my time with James, I had never actually been pregnant. I started blocking his friends from messaging me. I didn't want to deal with this any further, and I changed my mobile number. Then it started to get a little weird. It had been about a year since I'd left him by this point. I went shopping with my partner, and whilst we were out I saw his friend Mark. Mark was a married man with 3 children, and it was the strangest thing to see him out in the shops. He was alone, and from what I remembered, he was never alone. Even when James would host parties that were not child-friendly, Mark would show up with all of his children and with his wife, even when it was just meant to be boys' nights. I saw him standing around. He made complete eye contact with me, and then he pulled out his mobile and started texting. I tried not to think much of this. Yes, he was out on the other side of town from where I remember him living last. But he may have moved. Yes, his partner and his children weren't there, but they may have been in another store, or maybe they were sick and he was sent out on an errand. Maybe he was texting them. I tried to consider every logical explanation before resigning to the fact that there may have been a chance that he was messaging James. After this, I asked my partner if we could leave. I felt too uncomfortable to stay. The next time, I was at work. I worked in a gas station. The frontage was completely just windows, and parked out the front of my work was his friend, Adam. Adam was sitting in his car, and he kept staring at me, and then looking at his phone, and then staring at me more. At one point, he was texting, stopped texting, stared at me for a bit, and took a photo with his phone. I was scared. He sat there for at least 2 hours before finally leaving, not once exiting his car. When I told my co-worker what had happened, he told me to calm down because there was a chance that I was imagining it, and that it was all in my head. I consider the fact that I may have been paranoid, considering it had been 18 months since I had left. However, this was seeming more and more strange to me as time went by. I was scared that I was never going to be free of him. A short time after this, my partner had proposed to me, and I had said yes. Plans ensued and the messages slowly stopped. I thought I was free and my life was looking up, and I wish I could say that's where it ended, but it took a whole 2 years longer for it to stop. When I went out on my hen's night, I was in town drinking with my friends, when I saw one of James's friends, Natasha. She used to live out in the country, but it had been quite some time since I'd last heard from her or seen her. She stared at me from across the road before pulling out her phone and texting. I tried not to think anything of it. It had been weird enough those times it happened a few months prior, not without considering the fact that I was being stalked on my hen's night. I put the thought out of my mind and continued without thinking of it. During the time frame between my hen's night and scoping out the reception location, I received hundreds of messages from lots of his friends, including one message I can only assume was from James. It was an account that I didn't recognize. The name wasn't familiar and nothing about it was either. The message itself said things like, it was my fault things were so bad, that I was an awful person, that I should keep an eye on my family because accidents could befall them, and it would be my fault. I ignored these messages. I deleted them. I put them out of my mind and didn't mention them. I thought, if I ignored them to that extent, maybe I could carry on like it didn't happen. Maybe he would get bored and would leave me alone. But then one day I was scoping out the location for my reception when I got a message from James's brother, Luke. Luke had always seemed like a good kid. He was cheeky, but well behaved in the grand scheme of things. He asked me how I was, said that he wanted to be my friend, said that he missed my company, and that I was one of the most nicest people he'd ever encountered. He included that he had no contact with his brother any further, and that he'd moved to another state. I tried to take this in stride. I wanted to respond to him, but checking through his friends list, he was still friends with his brother, and his brother commented on a lot of his posts. I wasn't going to take this risk. I considered it a trap and deleted the message. Finally, it started to calm down with only one factor, a mutual friend called Gerard. He would constantly bring him up at any given point, even asking how I was coping from the breakup a full 2 years later at my wedding. I told him I didn't want to talk about it because it wasn't an appropriate subject for such a day, and to drop the subject indefinitely. This was one of the people who caused one of the greatest fallouts from one of my best friends. I still think he had some connection to James when this occurred, trying to isolate me further to make me go back. But I wasn't going to. This was not that kind of story. Things started to get quiet, aside from the occasional message, threatening the death of myself or my family members, or threatening the assault of my young niece. There wasn't much else. It was becoming easier to ignore, and then eventually it just tapered off into a stop. It stopped for about 3 months, and I was so happy. And then there was one final encounter. A messy, blonde woman wearing tracksuit pants, a tight white top, and high heels stumbled towards me. She smelt of alcohol. She screamed at me, "I know who you are! I know exactly who you are! You're that bitch! You know James is dead! James killed himself and it's your fault! It's your fault, you fucking bitch!" I decided to ignore this and swiftly walked back to my workplace. After that, I did some research. There was no record of James killing himself, and last I heard he was alive and living with his mother. It took 3 years for me to gain complete freedom from that abusive relationship. This story is from the perspective of a female. First off, I would like to say that I live in a house that has had more than a few strange coincidences. Cups falling off tables when they were a decent way from the edge, radio turning itself on when I turn it off at the power point. You know, that type of thing. Most of the time, I will try to explain these things away, but for the most part I just accept them as strange things that happen with minimal questioning. However, a few weeks ago, the strange thing that happened was completely explainable, and far more terrifying than the idea of a ghostly spectre. This was on a Saturday day. I was out in the back corner of the yard doing some gardening. The back door was unlocked so I could get in and out without having to fumble for my keys or battling with the sticky lock. When I finished up, I went to go back inside to see the screen door was open. This wasn't uncommon as the latch for it was old and dodgy and happened quite regularly. The night was perfectly fine too. I would walk around the house doing various chores, putting away laundry and putting some boxes of old things into the spare room where the Christmas tree is, and definitely set up with a plastic covering over the top. This is important to note, as whilst walking around the room, you cannot see behind it. As it got late, I took my shower and got ready for bed. Now, one thing I do, as I live alone, and generally keep the blinds closed once it is late enough, is I walk around in the nude. I'm sure a lot of people who don't have to worry about others do this too. As I am settling down, I hear creaking of floorboards that are louder than usual. This is still not out of the ordinary. I ignore it and start reading my book. The creaking continues along with a few other sounds, like furniture settling or moving in some form or another. A few of the doors creaked, and I decided to pay a little more attention. The doors creak on their own as the house has a draft, but I tend to get a little on edge when I hear it. By this time, I have my phone on my lap, ready to call the police if I need to, but I keep assuring myself I'm being paranoid. Now, it is my own personal preference to sleep with the door closed. It is far more comfortable to me. The bedroom door has a decent latch on it and never opens by itself, so you can understand why my stomach dropped and I went cold as the door slowly started to open. There was a man on the other side. I only caught a glimpse of him as I bolted over the bed end and slammed the door shut. I leaned against the door and dialed the police and gave them permission to break down the door to get in. The slamming on my bedroom door stopped shortly before the police showed up. They caught the man, and I later found out he had come in whilst I was gardening and was hiding in the blind spot behind my Christmas tree. He had tried stealing some jewellery, which most of is actually cheap eBay crap, and he also had one of my kitchen knives on him. After this, I spoke to my landlord about fixing the latch and replacing some of the older doors. I've also started locking the doors behind me, even if I'm only going out to hang out the laundry. Hey guys, Flamingo Creepy here. I'm just glad to hear those girls got away safe. Talk about the reason the edge of your seat was created. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, show me some love. If you have any of your own stories, send them in to me. I'll have my email, Facebook, and Tumblr in the description. These stories really have proven the fact the monster isn't under your bed. It's out in the street. Or maybe it's next to you in bed. Or apparently it can also be behind your Christmas tree. Either way, be safe, my little creepers.